Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to talk with you all about things that go boom. Specifically, the various kinds of missiles and torpedoes from Star Trek and Star Wars. Also, there's a coffee link in the description if you want to support the channel. As I'm sure you're all aware since you're watching a video like this, both Star Trek and Star Wars and their various factions make use of various types of missiles, torpedoes, and bombs in their various space battles or for bombarding planets. Star Trek seems to make far wider use of them than Star Wars, but that probably comes down to the mentality issue. Let me actually address that issue first. In all cases, on both sides, projectile weapons are a relatively finite resource. Sir, your ship can fire its phasers or turbolasers hundreds of times before they need new coils or more Tabana gas, but things like missiles are heavy, bulky, and require special handling in order to remain safe before firing. In Star Wars, this concern for what essentially amounts to logistics is actually kind of debilitating. As seen especially during the Clone Wars, everything is armed with blasters, which get their users destroyed all the time because Jedi in particular can just bounce the blaster bolts back at whoever shot them. You know what Jedi can't bounce back? Shotguns. And in fact, slug throwers, as they're called in Star Wars, were the go-to anti-Jedi weapon for the Mandalorians during their war. So why not give everyone slug throwers, especially since they're quite capable of defeating most armor as well? Basically logistics. Ammo of all varieties is bulky and heavy, and if you're outfitting thousands of droids or stormtroopers, that's a lot of extra mass to move around, and even with that, each soldier can only carry so much at a time. And even then, each magazine can only hold a handful of rounds. Blasters, on the other hand, have power packs instead of magazines, which are about the size of a bulky cell phone in most cases. And with a single power pack, you get hundreds of shots. In addition, since all blasters and turbolasers are basically the same tech, just at very different scales, they're all essentially plasma cannons. Basically, they use blaster gas, whatever happens to be, typically Tabana, and they just energize the heck out of it and send out a particle beam in the form of a blaster bolt. I don't know why they bother describing it this way. It's a plasma cannon. They're energizing the heck out of some gas, turning it into superheated plasma, and then launching that at targets. Anyway, since they're basically all the same tech, rearming all your soldiers is as simple as just going to wherever you keep your Tabana reserves in your ship and recharging the energy cells. No need for specialized ammo types for all your different calibers and cannons. All that to say, Star Wars doesn't make much use of any projectile weapons of any kind, though there are some notable exceptions. Starting back with A New Hope, Luke's shot to destroy the Death Star required a proton torpedo because the exhaust port was ray-shielded, meaning that matter could pass through but energy weapons could not. This makes sense because it was an exhaust port and the exhaust needs to go somewhere. This would also be a good time to mention how ships are actually protected in each universe. Both Star Trek and Star Wars use armor that is essentially composed of MacGuffinite, which is durable or fragile as the writers need it to be. In addition, both sides use shields, which again are as strong as or weak as they need to be, but they have some key differences. In Star Wars, shields are fairly generic and come in three varieties: energy, particle, and magnetic, at least generally speaking. Energy shields stop energy, particle shields stop objects, and magnetic shields provide basically no protection but retain atmosphere. They're just used around things like hangars where things need to be able to come and go freely without smashing into the shields. Just to be confusing, energy and particle shields are all called ray shields, so that's super not helpful. And depending on the ship that you're talking about, they'll have some combination of these or not at all. So like TIE fighters aren't shielded at all, they just rely on their armor. X-wings are energy shielded, but not particle shielded. And big ships are all basically, they have all three of the different types of shielding. Assuming they have a hangar, they'll have magnetic shields around that. They'll definitely have particle and energy shields to protect the ship. In Star Trek, there's powerful deflector shields which protect ships from all manner of attacks, particle, energy, whatever. Though sufficient damage can wear them down, and given sufficient knowledge of the specific shields being used, in particular the frequency at which they're operating, a foe could bypass the shields entirely, as you get to see in Generations, and the Borg do this from time to time too. I won't get too far into the weeds on how shields work because that's a whole different video. Instead, let's go back to missiles. Earlier or later in the Star Wars franchise, depending on how Yoda you want to get with your counting, you get to see a few missiles being used in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. In particular, we get to see a few homing and concussion missiles chasing down Obi-Wan and Anakin, and then blowing up debris or asteroids due to some fancy flying. These examples are interesting for a couple reasons. For one, the blast radius in all cases is significant but not gigantic, so all the munitions involved were high explosive in scale, not nuclear. The other notable element is that while their ability to track targets was undeniably impressive, they were all hilariously slow. What should have really been just 2 seconds of sheer terror followed by either evasion or destruction was in each case a protracted high-speed chase with the missiles inching ever closer and closer, that they're, playing with their food or something, or just, being nice enough to give the Jedi a chance to pull some shenanigans and get out of the way. Very, very slow missiles. The other notable exception from the prequels is when they're used during the ground battle on Geonosis. Again, the destruction is impressive, with the missiles being able to just one-shot AATs, but again, they're in the high explosives category, not even close to nuclear. And strangely, their guidance system seems to have been designed by a drunk who really just wanted a lot of curly bits in their smoke trails. Also, in mostly the prequels and the Clone Wars TV show, we get to see thermal detonators in use. This is the handheld equivalent. Technically, we first see these in The Return of the Jedi when Leia, pretending to be a bounty hunter, threatens Jabba and her whole palace, but she didn't actually blow anyone up with the grenades, so we don't get to see how dangerous they really are. Suffice to say, though, little poof of fire is all you really get from these, nothing spectacular. Also in Return of the Jedi, we get to see the Millennium Falcon fire a pair of concussion missiles into the main reactor at the core of the second Death Star after Wedge took out the regulator, causing the whole reactor to go critical, blowing up the station. Once again, these missiles are obviously just using conventional explosives, as the bulk of the explosions and ensuing fireball going on are all from the reactor itself going critical, not from the missiles. The missiles just basically set up the chain reaction. I should also note the more dumbfire weapons used by the folks in Star Wars. These are typically proton bombs, and we get to see them being used by assorted bombers, including TIE bombers and the awful Resistance bombers, which I have to mention, despite mentioning the sequels being sacrilege. Sorry everyone, they still exist. Basically, these do a decent amount of damage, and are even capable of cracking AT-AT armor apparently, and in sufficient quantity they're able to take down really large targets, like in Last Jedi where they take out a dreadnought. But their delivery requires flying directly over your target, so they're honestly a bit hazardous to use. In any case, they are non-atomic, but do decent damage to armor. Bombers can also drop fusion bombs, though the only time I can find where you actually get to see them being used is during the Great Purge of Mandalore, as shown in The Mandalorian. These bombs are actually on the level of nukes. We finally got one. In fact, in the case of Mandalore, they actually glassed the surface, turning it into something that the wiki is calling Trinitite, and the thorough bombing of the planet even disrupted the magnetic field of the planet, messing up communications and polluting the atmosphere. Finally, there's one more kind of missile I want to talk about with regards to Star Wars, and that is the Galaxy Gun from Legends. This thing was another attempt at a planet killer, but this time it would launch planet-killing missiles from a fixed point, orbiting the planet Biss, which was Palpatine's throne world, and la-da-da-da-da. Anyway, those missiles would then engage hyperdrives, which they had on board, in order to get to their target, at least in the area, before dropping out of hyperspace and then using shields combined with a variety of integrated turrets in order to survive the remaining trip to the target planet, where it would impact, and depending on the particular configuration, could do anything from just destroying a base on that planet, like a surgical strike, to just blowing the whole planet up with a runaway nucleonic chain reaction that would keep going as long as there was matter to fuel it. It's kind of like the Doctor device from Ender's Game, I guess. Unfortunately for all of us, Legends was always dubiously canon, and now that Disney has taken over, it's not canon at all. So I'm mentioning the Galaxy Gun not so much as a point of comparison, but more to just point out I'm aware that it exists. Kinda. I guess I'm aware that it doesn't exist anymore. Anyway, moving on to Star Trek, just like in Star Wars, projectile weapons are a finite resource, so they're not being thrown around constantly, but unlike Star Wars, they actually see moderate use all the time. Sticking to just the Federation, we have photon torpedoes, quantum torpedoes, transphasic torpedoes, Tri-Cobalt devices, photon mortars, and one that I would actually really love to have in real life because it's so cool, the TR-116 rifle. We'll start with the most commonly used projectile weapons, which date back all the way to the original series, photon torpedoes. Put simply, these are variable yield antimatter warheads. This means that their yield varies wildly depending on their type and application, but at minimum, we're talking about nukes. Unfortunately, the actual yield of these antimatter nukes is pretty much impossible to nail down since they are used mainly against ships, which are again made of MacGuffinite. But assuming that each just carries 1 kilogram of antimatter, which is probably a lowball estimate, and if all of that reacted with matter, that would be the equivalent of a 43 megaton nuke. For perspective, the largest nuke ever detonated was the Tsar Bomba by the Russian or the Soviets at the time. which was between 50 and 58 megatons, and the fireball alone was 8 kilometers in diameter, and the total blast radius was large enough to shatter windows 900 kilometers away. Our smaller yield torpedo would have a measly 7-kilometer fireball, and the shockwave would only break windows 7 to 800 kilometers away. That's assuming 1 kilogram of antimatter. In any case, we've seen multiple demonstrations of the damage the photon torpedoes can do. Probably the most direct one being in Generations, when a single torpedo, striking an unshielded bird of prey, one-shot the whole vessel. There's also a couple really neat additional features with photon torpedoes. They are highly configurable and have some really nice baseline features. For starters, if fired while at warp, they continue at warp, making them universally effective without modification for high-speed combat. Their guidance system can also be customized for unconventional targeting, as we get to see in Undiscovered Country, where a torpedo is set up to track excessive gas emissions and was able to strike a cloaked bird of prey after just flying around wildly for a few seconds trying to get a scent. Finally, they can also be set to a variety of detonation methods, from concentrated firepower to wide dispersal patterns, which don't do much damage but are really good for spreading stuff over a wide area. You get to see this when Data in Redemption Part 2 spread tachyons over a large area to reveal the presence of a bunch of cloaked Romulan ships. Super versatile weapons. Moving on, you get into the crazy stuff. You see, photon torpedoes are the lightweights in Star Trek. That's right, they start at antimatter warheads and go on up in power from there. Next up, we have quantum torpedoes. These torpedoes are basically weaponized zero-point energy, which if you're a fan of Stargate, you know that zero-point energy has the potential to be kinda just insane. How destructive they actually are is hard to say, more than a photon torpedo. And we do get a decent demonstration of their capabilities in First Contact, when a quartet of the torpedoes was sufficient to destroy a Borg sphere. And while spheres aren't as big or durable as cubes, they're still no slouches when it comes to durability and other capabilities. We then get into tricobalt devices. These aren't super well explained, but they're basically demonstrated to be demolition weapons. They don't have the guidance systems of normal torpedoes, and, like all torpedoes, weren't all that effective against shielded targets, but against weakly shielded or unshielded targets, they just are very thoroughly destructive. Probably the most iconic use of tricobalt devices was in the Voyager pilot, when they were used to destroy the caretaker array, leaving just dust behind. Finally, at the peak of torpedo tech, before we get into the more modern series and all their crazy stuff, basically I'm sticking to the shows from the 90s here, we have transphasic torpedoes, which were, spoilers, given to Voyager by future Janeway in the finale of the show to help them get home quicker. They could be launched from standard torpedo tubes, but packed enough punch that a single torpedo could one-shot a Borg cube. Remember that cubes demonstrated the ability to tank the combined firepower of whole fleets in their other encounters? Transphasic torpedoes are just insane. I also want to talk about the coolest rifle in Star Trek, the TR-116. Basically, this was an abandoned design that was created so that ground combatants would still have access to weaponry while in regions where their phasers just don't work for whatever reason. You can actually set up a disruption field so that nobody gets to use phasers, and that's where a lot of melee combat comes from a lot of the time. The level of damage that they could actually cause really wasn't all that special, comparable to a modern firearm really, but with a little modification, this rifle became legendary. In the DS9 episode Indiscretion, one of these rifles was used to assassinate a few people because of the crime of being happy, and tracking down the shooter was a huge pain in the butt because this particular rifle was also equipped with a micro-transporter, allowing him to, when used in conjunction with a exographic targeting sensor that allowed him to see through walls, he could fire a round, transport that round mid-motion to within a few centimeters of a target, and then let it continue forward, hitting them. Super cool. I honestly love this kind of thing, taking existing tech from Star Trek and combining it in a new and creative way to do something really cool. And what do you get this time? Well, you get a rifle that can shoot through walls without needing to punch holes in those walls. How cool is that? Finally, I want to have you all step back into the Wayback Machine and look at the original series episode Arena. This is the iconic episode where Kirk gets beat up by a Gorn and his comically slow haymakers before assembling a cannon out of some elemental sulfur, carbon, and potassium nitrate with diamonds for bullets and a hunk of bamboo as a rifle. It's pretty great fun, but the reason I bring it up is because at the beginning of the episode, Kirk and company beam down to a colony only to find that they've been hoodwinked and are stepping into a war zone. They manage to scrounge up a photon mortar and retaliate against the mysterious attackers and get away with their lives. So let me clarify this. Kirk gets a hold of a photon mortar the size of a baseball, launches it as enemies, and then has to take cover because the blast radius on a frickin' mortar is gigantic. And they take out all the assailants, shelling them from the distance in one shot. Was this actually an antimatter mortar? I sure hope not, but the demonstrated blast was pretty impressive regardless, so if it was conventional explosives, they managed to pack an awful lot of them into a very small package. So what's the verdict on this one? Well, I don't think anybody will debate me when I say that, by and large, explosive munitions in Star Trek are far more powerful than those in Star Wars. Aside from that, the Star Trek munitions seem to travel far faster than in Star Wars as well, and can even operate at warp. Guidance system-wise, Trek munitions have been known to miss, but I don't recall any getting actually intercepted or anything like that by, chaff or debris across all the series. Star Wars missiles do have some pretty impressive tracking abilities, but that really could just be because they're moving at such a glacial speed for munitions. It's supposed to be able to intercept things like fighters, and yet they have all the time in the world to maneuver. All that to say, it's easier to corner when you're doing 20 miles an hour than at 100 miles an hour. So, yeah, the only times that you see photon torpedoes missing are because they overshoot. As for something like the Galaxy gun in Star Wars, I could easily point to multiple calamitous level torpedoes. I mean, the Genesis torpedo one-shots a planet. It's not really supposed to, but, it's a terraforming device, and if you happen to terraform a planet where people are actually living already, the people living there already stop doing so. There's also Dreadnought from Voyager, which was a Cardassian device repurposed by the Maquis, which it was basically a Galaxy gun missile in that it could defend itself and continue on toward its target at warp. And yeah, that was also designed to just basically take out a planet. So there's equivalence, but as I mentioned in my phasers versus blasters episode, Trek the Federation in particular, doesn't do a lot of let me take out a planet type stuff. So the examples there are pretty few and far between because they just don't operate that way. All that to say, they can operate that way, they just don't. So my verdict? Star Trek missiles and torpedoes are superior to the Star Wars equivalents in basically every way. But what do you all think? Am I forgetting about some amazing Star Wars munitions that put photon torpedoes to shame? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.